Welcome to tonight's event in memory of Kristallnacht, the Night of Broken Glass. This is the 13th year that the Rodgers Center for Holocaust Education and the Fish Interfaith Center at Chapman University have jointly sponsored this interfaith evening of remembrance. 82 years ago tonight, on November 9th, 1938, a wave of anti-Semitic violence swept across Germany and Austria. It left in its wake thousands of shattered windows and ransacked businesses, hundreds of smoldering and desecrated synagogues, and at least 100 dead. Until that evening, Nazi persecution of German and Austrian Jews had been conducted under the cover of law. It began with the first major anti-Semitic law on April 7, 1933, which dismissed Jews and those deemed politically unreliable from the civil service. More anti-Jewish laws and regulations followed. In 1935, the Nazi government stripped Jews of their German citizenship and prohibited marriage with non-Jews. Dozens of regulations and decrees promulgated from 1933 through 1938 banned Jews from every facet of civic life. Jews could not attend public schools or universities. Jews could not own a car or a bicycle or a typewriter or even a pet. Jews could not attend a concert or see a movie or go to a restaurant. Elderly Jews who longed for a bit of sunshine and fresh air were prohibited from sitting on all but a very few park benches. Most benches were reserved for the so-called Aryans. In a mere 15 years, the Weimar Republic, established as a democracy in late 1918 after Germany's defeat in the Great War, had morphed into a dictatorship. Propaganda and promises persuaded the many to silently acquiesce in the persecution of the few: Jews, gays, Roma, Afro-Germans. A minority of Germans dared to speak out against the Nazis' actions. Among them were the editors and writers of the Munich Post, who published expose after expose about the Nazi Party and its leader. They did so in the face of unrelenting harassment, including libel suits and death threats, until March 1933, when the Nazis banned all opposition newspapers. Soon thereafter, Nazi thugs pillaged the newspapers' offices, destroyed their printing press, and imprisoned the paper's editors and reporters. Only a few days later, on March 20th, Dachau, the first permanent concentration camp, opened. Among its first prisoners were anti-Nazi journalists, politicians, judges, pastors, priests, and educators. By the end of 1937, almost 1,000 pastors of the Confessing Church, the segment of the Protestant Evangelical Church organized in resistance to the Nazi-supported state church, had been sent to concentration camps. Many of them would die there. The Nazis portrayed the events of November 9th and 10th, 1938, as a spontaneous demonstration of anger following the murder of a German diplomat in Paris by a Jewish teenager. Herschel Greenspan had become distraught after learning that his Polish-born parents, who had lived in Germany since 1911, had been deported, refused entry into Poland, and confined to a squalid no-man's land between the two countries. We know that the Nazi leadership had been waiting for just such an opportunity to take their persecution of the Jews to the next level. The violence of November 9th was followed the next day by the arrest of some 28,000 Jewish men and teenagers. They had done nothing to deserve it. Among those teenagers was cantor Leopold Schneer, whose recorded voice you will hear this evening. Holocaust survivor and author Elie Wiesel said that the opposite of love is not hate, it is indifference. For the most part, it was not hatred, for most Germans did not hate their Jewish neighbors, colleagues, and friends, but it was indifference that permitted the hatred and violence of Kristallnacht and the genocide that would follow. Tonight, through words of remembrance and reflection, and through the story of one individual who exemplified courage and compassion, we remember all those who were persecuted and the few who stood with them, who refused to be silent and indifferent, and who instead spoke out and acted against a vile and unjust government.
It is an honor for myself and Fish Interfaith Center students and alumni to join Dr. Marilyn, Harran, and the Rodgers Center for Holocaust Education for this event. For over a dozen years, Chapman University has held this annual interfaith commemoration of Kristallnacht. We miss seeing you face to face this year, but we are so grateful to have you join us virtually. It's a strange time. Unable to be together, we are currently living in a time of vast uncertainty. Some days we wonder how we'll all survive. In the midst of a global pandemic, in our own communities and the world over, people are confined or falling ill or having difficulty feeding and housing their families. If that was not enough, we are witnessing political upheaval at home and dangerous national fanaticism here and abroad. We experience increasingly visible acts of white supremacy and racist violence against Black and brown people, and continued anti-Semitism and violence against all religious minorities. During this era of disruption, we can look to survivors throughout history for inspiration and direction. Shortly, we will have the particular privilege of hearing author Timothy Boyce recount the incredible journey of his rediscovery of an out-of-print diary of daily life in the Nazi concentration camps, written by Odd Nansen. We will hear more of how Odd Nansen wrote his diary on onion-thin paper over a period of 3.5 years of confinement, capturing both the humanity displayed by survivors and the horrors perpetrated in those camps. As I read his diary, I kept asking why, knowing he could be killed at any moment were the pages discovered. Why did Nansen write? Boyce points out that time and time again, Nansen admits, I must write, I cannot leave it alone. He was driven to write. And his words are now available as both a warning never to repeat such a human atrocity as the Holocaust, and as an inspiration to write, to share, to do something in our time that might offer hope. His need to write brought to mind for me another author, Tilly Olson, the daughter of Russian Jewish immigrants to the United States, who throughout the Depression, the Great Depression and following, wondered how she would survive, confined to the endless daily tasks of a working-class woman, unable to find time to write. She experienced, as she put it, having to let writing die over and over again in me. Yet when she finally published, she became an inspiration to countless women writers in the decades to come. At this moment in history, who can we look to for inspiration. What is it within us that needs to be expressed? What is it we cannot fail to do, even though it might endanger us? What is it the world and our community needs from us right now to survive and to thrive? How will we offer memory, resilience, and hope to future generations? A great start is being here for this virtual event to gain hope and inspiration from those we will hear together. Thank you for joining us.
Martin Niemöller, a German pastor and theologian, at first supported Hitler's rise to power. He quickly became disillusioned. Indeed, he became the leader of a group of German Protestant clergy opposed to the Nazis. Hitler detested Niemöller, and in 1937, he had him arrested for treason and confined first in the Sachsenhausen concentration camp and later in Dachau. Liberated by the Allies in 1945, Niemöller became a leading voice of penance and reconciliation for the German people. And now, the poem by Martin Niemöller. First, they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me.
In Action Against the Jews by Arnold Bloom. I stood before the burning shul and watched as the firemen protected the surrounding buildings, being careful not to put any water on the isolated curls of smoke rising here and there from the devastated sanctuary that once was our shul. I stood before the burning shul, unbelieving, in deep shock, empty of strength, gutted, as was our shul. A murder had been committed, symbolic as it were, soon to be followed by the near annihilation of our people. Slowly, my senses returned in a wave of anger. I clenched my fists, my eyes filled with tears and outrage. My silence screamed, Kuma Adonai ve'afutshu ovecha. Rise up, Lord, and scatter your enemies. But the clouds did not part. The shofar did not sound. The strong hand and outstretched arm did not appear. It was not the year of the Lord. He had averted his face. On Friday, November 11th, 1938, around 6 o'clock in the morning, they came for us. We had lived in a state of apprehension since the previous day when our shul had been burned to the ground and the Jewish places of business destroyed. We had entered a twilight zone between memories of earning our keep at our occupations and the fear of becoming game during hunting season. We were confined in this crowded, stinking place for several hours, standing while being pressed together ever closer as more and more Jews were added. An SS man addressed us to tell us where we were going, to Dachau. As I climbed aboard the bus, the thought flashed before my mind that despite our differences in age, status, and wealth, and degree of our religious observance, our Jewishness alone was the interest to our oppressor.
Evening of November 8th, at night, we smelled fire, we heard explosions, but we lived near a synagogue, but we didn't dare go out to see what's going on. The next morning, I went to school. I had a 45-minute walk to school because we were forbidden to use public transportation. On the way, I passed a Jewish neighborhood, a Jewish street, a street where mostly jewelry stores were that were owned by Jews. The glass was all over the streets. The SA and the brown shirt men were standing, yelling, screaming, "Don't buy from Jews. We want to get rid of the Jews." I walked to school. Of course, we were dismissed, and I had to walk back through the same tragedy home.
Kristallnacht 1938. It is a moment of unforgettable pictures and experience. Imagine going to school in the morning on a sunny day in Berlin, on the bicycle, expecting nothing evil. An hour into the class, the director of the school herself, Dr. Leonora Goldschmidt, came running around and said, "Go home, get to your bicycle, hurry up. We are surrounded by Hitler Youth and by SS and SA. They are throwing stones. Don't make eye contact." Yes, I made it home. But there is something that you cannot avoid, and that's a touch of culture shock and fear, because my family had lived a totally integrated life in Germany until the little town of East Prussia, with Hitler coming into their government, suddenly found us, 5 boys in the whole school, isolated because we were Jews, we were outsiders, we should be beaten up, and the teachers could not defend us because they would lose their job. My father moved us to Berlin. There was a Jewish directorship in this particular school, and we had a smooth sailing for about a year. My father's career as a lawyer was finished. He was not allowed to go to court any longer. And naturally, there was the possibility of finding a way to get out of Germany. But my father was an eternal optimist. Hitler is a madman. What can they do? The German people will realize that this cannot last. And now, my flashback to Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass. I ran back from school. The director told us to do that. I got home. My parents were very worried, and I really had a sort of culture shock because our life was integrated, and now all of a sudden we were outsiders again, and I was 12, I was almost 13 years old, put away the calculators. I was being prepared for bar mitzvah, to become an adult. However, it was very difficult because coming home, my mother walked me to the window, and what I saw was smoke. And the smoke was from the Fasanstrasse synagogue, 2 blocks away, where the bar mitzvah was going to take place. But the pictures of Jude scrabbled on the glass and smashed, the looting, the mob, the screaming, was something that I shall never forget. It's a picture engraved in one's mind.
Kristallnacht found me in Dienstlaken, Germany, in a kinderheim that was actually conducted by Dr. Rothschild, one of the Rothschild family. We had an ordinary day that day. It was the 9th of November, and somehow we had just dinner and things were going along fine, and suddenly all the lights went out. We were just terribly shocked because then it became totally dark, and my best friend and I, Kate, grabbed each other by the hand and we tried to run to the beginning of the dining room. I didn't hear any our counselors were shouting directions that neither of us were hearing, and as we were trying to get into the front of the dining room, we encountered an invasion, it seemed, of strangers, big men with heavy black boots and stomping all around us. Like one person, we flew into the pantry and kind of found refuge amongst all the amongst paper goods and brooms and whatever happens to be in the pantry. There was an enormous amount of crystal being broken down. We heard glass chattering and thundering sounds, and suddenly we watched in horror as all our furnishings in the dining room were thrown through what used to be just a few minutes ago doors and windows. We saw that even from the upstairs, all our belongings and the beddings were being thrown in the backyard into our playground, where usually there were swings and fun equipment for us to use. The next day, it was the 10th of November. We were able to get back to the kinderheims, the backyard where all the items were thrown, and there was just chaos all over. And I was viewing what was going on around me with all the rubble that was on the floor, and lo and behold, a miracle happened. I saw my photo album sticking out from amongst all the rubble that had been thrown there the night before. Picked everything up, and my pictures were just here and there and everywhere, and I was able to find all of them and put them together. And I must say that those pictures were presented for me my identity, my very being, because that's all that was really proving that I existed, and it was going to be my identity for many years.
I wanted absolutely to see my synagogue. My parents, may they rest in peace, never agreed to this. The day goes by, another day. It is November the 12th. And I did, like some other kids do today, not listen to my parents. And I swindled myself out, and I went to the synagogue. I mean, it was a catastrophe. And people were around there and were speaking to each other. This was my goodness. So I said to the people, isn't it a shame what they did to this synagogue? But it didn't take long. I was taken from both sides. Two men in civil take me away. Where did they take me? To Dachau.
In the aftermath of Kristallnacht, close to 30,000 German Jewish men were sent to concentration camps. One of those camps was Sachsenhausen, near Berlin. It opened only a few weeks before the Nazi leadership welcomed the athletes of the world to the 1936 Olympic Games. Norwegian resistance member Odd Nansen would enter Sachsenhausen some 7 years later, in October 1943, after having already been imprisoned for close to 2 years in Norwegian concentration and forced labor camps run by the Nazis. An architect by training, Nansen was the son of the world-famous explorer Fridtjof Nansen, who received the Nobel Peace Prize in 1922 for his work with famine victims and refugees. Like his father, Odd Nansen was a person of courage and conviction, who refused to be a bystander to suffering. By the end of 1939, the organization he helped found, Nansen Relief, had brought 260 Jews from Nazi-occupied Czechoslovakia to Norway. Nansen was taken hostage by the Nazis in January 1942 in retaliation for a British commando raid on Norway. In Sachsenhausen, he learned of a 10-year-old survivor of the Auschwitz Death March, who was recovering in the camp's infirmary from surgery to remove several of his frostbitten toes. As we will learn tonight, Nansen intervened to protect, help, and inspire this young Jewish boy in a way that would have a lasting impact on the rest of his life. In the camps, Nansen kept a secret diary published in English in 1949 and hailed at the time by the New York Times as, quote, unlike any other record of personal war experiences which has yet appeared, unquote. Decades later, the work was out of print when it was rediscovered by our speaker, Timothy Boyce, who vowed to bring this remarkable document back into print. Timothy Boyce is a graduate of Georgetown University's School of Foreign Service, the Wharton School of Finance, and the University of Pennsylvania Law School. Thanks to the dedication of Mr. Boyce, who extensively annotated the original diary and wrote a new introduction, we can once again read Nansen's extraordinary 600-page secret record, now published by Vanderbilt University Press. Tim's labor of love is a remarkable achievement in its own right. Now, to tell us about Odd Nansen and his diary, Timothy Boyce.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. This is Timothy Boyce speaking to you from Western North Carolina. I'm going to be speaking to you tonight about a gentleman named Odd Nansen and a diary that he kept while he was a prisoner of the Nazis for 3.5 years during World War II. Let me pull up my PowerPoint. As I said, gentleman named Odd Nansen and a diary that he called from day to day. Here is an image of the book. What I'd like to do to begin this talk is actually tell you a story. And I'd like you all to join in with me and play along, do a little bit of role playing here. I think you can all do it. All I ask is that you imagine that you are once again 10 years old. So imagine that you're 10 years old. Instead of waking up in a nice soft bed in a nice cozy house in Orange, California, or in Tryon, North Carolina, imagine that you're 10 years old and you find yourself waking up in a concentration camp. And not just any concentration camp, camp called Auschwitz. And the date is January 1945. The guards have just come into your barracks. and they're screaming and shouting and bellowing the command, Raus, Raus. Raus is a German word that means out. Everybody out. We're evacuating this camp. So you line up outside your barracks, you join this marching column that is already miles long. You slowly make your way out through the front gate onto these back roads. And for the next 3 days, you march through the snow and ice and mud and slush in bitterly cold temperatures. Remember, it's January. And on the third day, you reach a rail junction, at which point you're put on a cattle car. Cattle car has 4 sides, but no roof, no heat, no protection from the elements. And you spend the next 10 days in that cattle car as this train slowly makes its way out of southwestern Poland, takes a long southerly detour through Czechoslovakia, and finally turns north into Germany and comes to a stop about 25 miles north of Berlin at another concentration camp, this one called Sachsenhausen. When you get there, you're grateful that you're still alive. Thousands of people died in what became known in history as the Auschwitz Death March. As I say, you've made it. You're grateful for that fact. But it doesn't mean that you're not suffering. It doesn't mean you're not hurting by this point. In fact, by the time you get to Sachsenhausen, you can barely walk into the camp under your own power. You've got shooting pains in both of your feet. But up until now, you dare not take off your boots to see what's wrong with your feet for a variety of reasons, including the fear that if you take off your boots, somebody will steal them from you. I mean, it's a dog-eat-dog world by January 1945. But now that you're in Sachsenhausen, you take off your boots to see what's wrong with your feet, and you see that you've got a severe case of frostbite. In fact, so severe that the flesh on your toes is already starting to rot. So you know you've got to get medical attention. I mean, that's the logical thing to do. That's what you and I do when we get sick or we get injured, we get medical attention. But in the crazy, upside-down, illogical world of the concentration camps, the Revier, which is the German word for the infirmary, was actually considered the most dangerous place you could go. The prisoners called it the waiting room for the gas chamber. Because if you think about it, if you're lying in a hospital bed, you're not working. And if you're not working, you're not contributing to the camp. And since every prisoner is expendable, why waste any resources on you? But you also know that if you don't get some medical attention, given the condition of your feet, you're certainly going to come down with gangrene sooner or later. And once you've got gangrene in your legs, you're as good as dead. So you screw up your courage, you report to the infirmary, and luckily for you, there's a kindly doctor on duty that day. He takes one look at your feet, sees how bad of the condition your feet are in. He picks you up by the scruff of your clothes. And remember, you're only a 10-year-old child at this point. Carries you over to an operating table, gives you some ether to knock you unconscious. And the next thing you know, you're coming back into consciousness, you're waking up, and you realize you're lying in a hospital bed in the Revier now. You look down, see your feet, you see both of them are heavily bandaged. And the orderlies in that hospital ward explain to you that the doctor had to amputate some of your toes in order to try to save your feet. So now you're lying in this bed probably wondering, how long can I stay here before a Nazi doctor comes in and says, we need to make more room for prisoners, which is usually a signal for a selection of prisoners to be sent off to the gas chamber. While you're thinking those somber thoughts, hundreds, if not thousands of prisoners are streaming through the Revier. They're coming in to visit friends who are sick, to see them. They're coming in to get medical attention. Some of them are coming in just to get out of the cold in some cases. But the one constant is none of them are paying the slightest bit of attention to you. I mean, after all, they don't know who you are. You're not a member of their extended family. You're not from their village. You're just some strange child who just recently arrived from Auschwitz. Many of them probably can't even speak the same languages that you can speak, which are German and Polish. But then one day, a middle-aged man comes into the infirmary. He's coming to visit one of his friends who is sick. And instead of walking right by your bed like everybody else has, he stops. He starts talking to you. He asks you, child, what's your name? Where are you from? Where are your parents? Do you know anybody in this camp? Do you have any friends at all? In other words, unlike any other human being, at least this one middle-aged man is showing some interest in you and some sympathy for your plight. Now, why am I telling you this story? Well, first of all, that happens to be a true story. The child that I've been describing was a young boy named Thomas Bergenthal. Here's a picture taken of Tommy in 1938. He's all of 4 years old in that picture. He would be taken captive by the Nazis in the fall of 1939 and spend the rest of World War II, the entire duration of the war, along with his mother and father, as a captive of the Nazis for no other crime, as he says, other than the fact that he was a Jew. And the man who stopped to talk to him was a Norwegian named Odd Nansen. Now, the second reason why I'm telling you this story is that that chance meeting between these two people changed both their lives. When I call this a chance meeting, you have to consider the fact that by the spring of 1945, Sachsenhausen had a prisoner population of approximately 35,000 people. It was the size of a small city. And the chance of any two people running into each other was very small. In fact, there was not one, but 4 different revières, infirmaries in the camp. So the chances that Nansen would be in the same revière as Tom was even that much smaller. But that chance meeting, as I said, changed both their lives. In Tommy's case, it literally meant the difference between life and death, because from that day forward, Nansen used his food and tobacco rations to bribe the orderlies to look out for Tommy, to protect him. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, how does Nansen have enough food and tobacco that he can be giving it away in the form of bribes? I thought everybody was starving in these camps. But that's not a completely accurate picture of how these camps were operated. And to understand this, what you have to understand is the way the Nazis viewed the world was through the lens of race. To them, race kind of determined and explained everything. And in what they called their Weltanschauung, which means their worldview, of course, the Nazis believed that they belonged to the Aryan race. And the Aryan race were the Harran folk, the master race that was going to rule this new world order that they were creating in Europe. At the bottom of the totem pole, of course, the Nazis put the Jews, who they considered to be Untermenschen. But the Nazis had to find a pecking order for every race. We would call them nationalities in most cases, so they would know how to deal with them. And the Nazis looked at the Scandinavian prisoners, both the Norwegians and the Danes, and they said, in many ways, you are racially akin to us. You're almost like first cousins. I mean, after all, you're tall, you're blonde-haired, you're blue-eyed. You can't be Aryan because you're not Germanic, but you're pretty close. So we're going to put you just one notch below us in this pecking order. We think you're racially superior to everybody else. And by virtue of that kind of racial classification, the Nazis allowed the Scandinavian prisoners one benefit in these camps that they didn't allow to anybody else. And that is they allowed them to receive food parcels from the Red Cross. And if you had food, you were rich. You could do just about anything. So Nansen had the wherewithal to help Tommy by virtue of the food he was getting from the Red Cross. Now, I mentioned a few moments ago that this chance meeting changed both of their lives. In Nansen's case, there really isn't much that an injured 10-year-old child who has just been recovering from having some toes amputated can do. But I think if you read Nansen's diary, I think you have to come to the conclusion that by the spring of 1945, that when he meets Tommy, that Nansen is heading for a mental breakdown. And after all, he's been in different concentration camps at this point for over 3 years. He's seen every kind of barbarity imaginable. And every time when he thinks things can't get any worse, of course, they manage to get worse. And this is what Nansen wrote about meeting Tommy. He wrote this after the war. And he writes, "Everywhere I went in the camp, Tommy's angelic face popped up. Without suspecting it, Tommy accomplished with us a work of salvation. He touched something in us which was about to disappear. He called to life again human feelings, which were painful to have, human feelings that are painful to have, and yet they were nevertheless meant salvation for us all." So I think meeting Tommy pulled Nansen out of the mental tailspin that he was finding himself in and gave him that impetus to keep going to the end of the war. The third reason why I'm telling you this story is that that chance meeting between these two people ended up changing my life as well. Now, of course, I wasn't old enough to be alive during World War II. It would take 60 years for that event to ultimately intersect with my life and change it forever. Now, as you can see from looking behind me, I've got a fairly large library here at home, and almost every single book you see on those bookshelves is a history book. I just love reading history. I'm enamored by it. And every chance I get, or at least pre-COVID, every chance I had, to go into a bookstore, whether a new bookstore or a used bookstore, I always made a beeline there just to see what new books there might be. So in the year of 2010, we're going back 10 years ago now, I went into a bookstore in Charlotte, North Carolina, which is where I was living and working at that point, and I came across this newly published book, a book called The Lucky Child, written by somebody named Thomas Bergenthal. I had never seen the book before, I never heard of it, I had never heard of Tom Bergenthal before, but that subtitle, A Memoir of Surviving Auschwitz as a Young Boy, that's what caught my eye. I thought this has got to be a fascinating story. So really, just on an impulse, I bought it, took it home, started reading it. And I learned the story that I just related to you, how Tommy ends up in Auschwitz, how he takes part in the evacuation, the Auschwitz death march, how he arrives in Sachsenhausen with frostbitten feet, how he just accidentally meets Nansen, and Nansen intervenes and saves his life by bribing the orderlies. And at that point in this memoir of Tom Bergenthal's, which is fascinating, he says, by the way, this Nansen fellow who saved my life, he kept a diary while he was a prisoner. Then he adds just one footnote on the bottom of page 177. It's the only footnote in the entire book that gives a description of this diary, the name of it, publisher of it, the date it was published. And I read this footnote and I thought to myself, well, since Tom Bergenthal's memoir has been utterly fascinating, maybe this diary would also be interesting. It'll certainly give a different perspective on many of the same events. And again, when you have this many books in your house, buying another book is the easiest thing in the world. The bar is set pretty darn low. So I knew that I'd have to look on the internet for this. Of course, the book has been out of print at that point since 1949. But we all know that anything that's for sale is going to be found somewhere on the internet. And I've bought a lot of out-of-print books on the internet. I know where to look. So I did a search. Again, this is back in 2010. And I was able to find one copy. I repeat, one single copy of this book for sale in the entire United States. I found 2 more for sale in Great Britain, 1 in Australia, 1 in New Zealand. That's it. 5 in the entire world. Where all the other copies have disappeared to, or had disappeared up to that point, I know not. But I decided to buy one of those. I ordered the one from the bookseller in New Zealand, of all places. And when it came, I started reading it. And within a very short period of time, perhaps a week, 10 days, maybe it was 2 weeks now, I can't quite exactly remember, but I was absolutely hooked by this book. I couldn't put it down. I was reading it day and night. And I kept saying to my wife, I can't believe that this book, which to me is the making of a masterpiece, it is probably head and shoulders better than any one of these books behind me. How can it be that no one else has seen fit to republish this book in the last 60 years, 6 decades? It's a lifetime. And I don't know the answer to that question. But again, if you reflect on the fact that there's only 5 copies circulating for sale in the entire world, the chance of anybody even finding out about this book and reading it was pretty darn slim. So I made up my mind that I would get this book back into print. And without really having any clear idea of my path to getting this thing published, with just pretty much just the enthusiasm and my dedication to making sure that Nansen's words got back into the mainstream press, I worked on this for 6 years. And in 2016, Vanderbilt University Press published a newly edited and annotated. I edited the diary, I annotated the diary. I also added photographic evidence from the war and the time that Nansen was in prison. And we published this, as I say, in 2016. What I'd like to do in the time I've got available to talk to you tonight, what I'd like to do is focus on kind of just the highlights, the who, what, how, where, and when. So let's begin. Who was Odd Nansen? Well, as I said, he was a Norwegian. This is a family photograph. And Odd Nansen is the young child in his mother's arms. This picture is taken in 1902. Odd Nansen was born in December 1901. And you can see he's the 4th child born to his mother, Eva Nansen, and his father, Fridtjof Nansen. Nansen's parents were very well-to-do, very accomplished in Norwegian society, both very artistic. Unfortunately for Nansen, his mother died when he was only 6 years old of pneumonia. So Nansen was raised pretty much single-handedly by his father, Fridtjof Nansen. Although that name doesn't resonate with many people here in America, in Norway, Fridtjof Nansen is probably considered one of the most famous, if not the most famous man the country has ever produced. He was truly a prodigy. He was a polar explorer. He held the record for getting closest to the North Pole that stood for quite some time. He was a statesman. He helped Norway achieve its independence in 1905 from Sweden. He was the person who convinced Prince Karl of Denmark to become the new king of Norway under the form of constitutional monarchy, which is the form of government they wanted. And then most spectacularly, after World War I ends, the League of Nations appoints him the first High Commissioner of Refugees. And he does such a good job that he is awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 1922. So you can see Nansen inherited many of these traits from his parents. He was, first of all, the bearer of the Nansen name. Number two, he was very artistic, and we're going to see some of his sketches in this. And he has a total of 40 sketches that are published in the diary. And he also kind of inherited that humanitarian sensibility from his father, Fridtjof Nansen. So why did Nansen write the diary in the first place? Well, he writes in his foreword that he never anticipated that he was going to publish this diary. He says, I wrote it, well, first of all, he was a diarist for pretty much his entire life. He had been writing a diary or a journal ever since he was a young teenager. I've seen many of them on my trips to Norway. So it was kind of natural for him to continue. But he says, I really did it for two reasons. First of all, I did it for myself. He says, writing in my diary was, quote, like confiding in a close friend and relieving my mind of all that weighed on it. It became a private manner of forgetting. He said the second reason why he did it was for his wife, Kari. He wanted her to know what was really going on inside these different camps that he was a prisoner in. Now, she could occasionally write letters to him. They were censored. She could also occasionally, at least while he was a prisoner in Norway, visit him. And here's, in fact, Nansen's sketch of what he calls a visit. Now, as you can see from the sketch, number one, he's separated by a physical barrier from his family. And even more importantly, there's a guard standing right there listening to the entire conversation who can speak Norwegian. So what can you say in a situation like that? Really not much. So the diary became his way of communicating with his wife and telling her about what was really going on in the camp. In fact, many of his diary entries begin with the words, Dear Kari, remember, let me tell you what happened today. I got to write this down before my memory starts fading. And many of his diary entries end with the words, good night, Kari. You know, in his mind, he is communicating with her. He's writing out loud to her in these pages of this diary as to exactly what life is like in these different camps. Now, why was Nansen arrested in the first place? Well, Nansen, again, as I've already mentioned, was quite a famous man carrying the Nansen name. As you know, or may know, the Germans overran Norway and occupied the country in April of 1940. Nansen joined the resistance, although the Germans were not aware of that and never caught him as a member of the resistance. And in late 1941, it was December 26th, December 27th, the British launched a commando raid against the coastline of Norway. These highly trained British commandos, they land along the coast. They quickly blow up a number of factories there that are involved in munitions. They shoot a number and kill a number of German soldiers in the process. They capture other Germans, take them back as POWs back to England. 48 hours later, they've taken off. They're on their boats heading back to Great Britain. And this drove the German overlord of Norway, Joseph Terboven, furious that the British could pull this off. And he was almost even more furious at the royal family that was living in exile in Great Britain and here in America, because he felt the royal family must be putting the British up to doing this. So he said, the way I'm going to get back at the royal family is I'm going to arrest 20 of the most prominent citizens in this country, and I'm just going to hold them as hostages, as an insurance policy in case things get worse. Because then people will think twice before they embark on these kind of adventures again, knowing that I've got these people in prison. So the royal physician was arrested, the royal chamberlain was arrested, and on January 13th, 1942, Odd Nansen was picked up. So Nansen would spend from January 13th, 1942, until the very closing weeks of the war as a captive of the prisoner, a captain of the Germans, and with a hostage, with a designation not of political prisoner, not of communist, not of homosexual, not of Jehovah's Witnesses, all the other types of prisoners who are in camp, but as a hostage. And that's how he remained. Now, how did Nansen manage to keep a diary in the most difficult place you could possibly keep a diary? In fact, getting caught red-handed with a diary was probably a pretty quick way of getting yourself executed. In Nansen's diary, he once mentions how a Dutch prisoner is caught with a diary. He's hauled away and no one ever sees him alive again. Well, Nansen says while he was a prisoner in Norway, which he was for about 18 months of his incarceration, it wasn't that difficult to write the diary. Nansen was one of these people who, much like his father, had the facility to be able to work and operate on almost no sleep. He could get just a few hours of sleep each night and continue on the next day. So he would spend the wee hours of the morning writing in his diary while everybody else in the barracks was asleep. In fact, many of his diary entries end with the words, "Well, it's getting on at close to 2:30 in the morning. I better stop now. I'll pick this up again tomorrow." Then Nansen says once he wrote the diary pages, hiding them wasn't a particular problem. He says, "I would put them in the one place I knew the Germans would never go to look, and that was in the latrine." The Germans stayed out of the latrine at all costs. To them, it was just a source of infectious diseases. So the real question is then, how did Nansen get the pages of the diary out of the camp? Well, Nansen, again, while he's in Norway, found it quite easy to smuggle portions of the diary out. Because you have to remember, who is bringing in food into this camp? Sachsenhausen had a prisoner population at its height of about 7,000 prisoners. So a lot of food is being brought in on almost a daily basis. This was way before you have lots of frozen foods. So it's Norwegian civilians. Who's bringing in the building supplies as they continue to build more and more barracks? Norwegian civilians. Who are the tradesmen who are coming in to do the repairs and doing construction work? Norwegian civilians. And the people on the other side of the barbed wire are their cousins, their neighbors, their friends, their in-laws. So everybody was willing to do some smuggling on behalf of their prisoners, and every prisoner was trying to smuggle something out. So Nansen naturally used his diary pages as his way of communicating again with his wife, Kari. And she would hide these pages in their house as they were delivered to her by these various cooperating Norwegians. Well, in the summer of 1943, Nansen gets in trouble with the commandant in the camp that he's in. The camp is called Gnini. It's located outside of Oslo. And the commandant says to him, "I'm going to punish you now, and I'm going to send you to a real concentration camp, to a camp in Germany. And you should tell your family to put up a headstone for you now, because you're not coming back from this experience." So Nansen is sent off to Sachsenhausen. He arrives on October 6th, 1943. And when he gets there, he writes in his diary, "I don't know how I'm ever going to get these pages of this diary out of this camp. Now I'm in the middle of a hostile territory. But psychologically, it's so important for me to keep writing at this point, because for my own mental well-being, that I'm just going to keep writing this diary and hoping against hope that I can figure some way to get it out of the camp. And if I can't, if the war ends, assuming I'm still alive and I'm allowed to get out of this camp, if I haven't figured some way to smuggle this diary out of the camp, then I will bury it in the ground," I guess with the idea that he'd try to come back and retrieve it. And portions of diaries have been found buried in the ground at other concentration camps over the last 6-7 decades, primarily in Auschwitz. So other people had the same theory, the same desire as Nansen had. But then one day Nansen says, "I had a brainstorm. And I realized that even though I was searched along with all of my fellow prisoners when we left the camp, all the work that was done by the prisoners was done outside the camp grounds. And they were all searched when they left. They were all searched when they came back. He says, I realized what the Germans were primarily worried about were the prisoners somehow getting their hands on weapons and then smuggling them into the camp, stockpiling them, and then having an uprising. I mean, after all, there had been an uprising in Auschwitz. There had been an uprising in Sobibor. There had been an uprising in Treblinka. So this was foremost on the guards' minds. And Nansen says, I realized that as a result, they really weren't paying attention to the other things that we prisoners carried with us almost at all times. If we could get our hands on a tin cup, we'd almost carry our tin cup with us all the time by tying around our waist with a string. And the other thing that we would carry with us whenever we had the chance was something they called a breadboard. A piece of wood about this big, measures maybe 4 inches by 9 inches, or maybe a little bit smaller. And in the morning, when you'd line up in your barracks, the person in charge of your barracks, and the title was blockout tester, means barracks leader, one of their responsibilities was to dole out your daily bread ration. You'd line up, you'd hold out your breadboard, you'd get a half a loaf of black bread, and that was yours to eat or barter or do anything you want for the rest of the day, but it was up to you. When you were out at your work site, if you wanted to eat off a surface, you needed your breadboard. Even at night, there was not enough room in these barracks that were overcrowded to sit at a table. So oftentimes, this was pretty much the only surface you had. And Nansen says, I realized that I could go to one of my Norwegian friends who worked in the carpentry shop, who had access to some tools, and have him split my breadboard open lengthwise, hollow out the inside of it, and I would put the pages of my diary in the breadboard, and when it was full, I'd put the breadboard back together, I'd glue it, sand it, and no one would be any worse for the wiser. And so at the end of the war, Nansen and 5 of his closest friends walked out of the camps with their breadboards. Nobody even gave him a second thought or a second look. And that's how they smuggled the entire German portion of this diary out of the camp. And here's a picture of a real breadboard. As you can see from that, the texture of the paper, it was tissue thin paper that Nansen was writing on. So he could get a lot of pages into a small cavity. The other thing that's a little bit hard to tell from this, but this writing is microscopically small, such that when these pages were then transcribed for publication back in 1947 in Norway, the typist needed magnifying glasses just to read Nansen's writing. This is not Nansen's breadboard. This is a breadboard from one of his friends. Nansen's breadboard is on display in Norway's World War II Museum. So that kind of sums up a little bit of the who, what, why, and when of Nansen's incarceration. And what I really love to do, if I had more time, is read you plenty of excerpts from this diary, because I could open it up to almost any page and you'd find something that's eloquent, that's insightful. I mean, Nansen really was a terrifically talented writer and a terrifically talented human being to be able to kind of pierce through the human condition and describe it. And of course, this diary also has its share of horror. But to me, the power of it, and the reason why I spent 6 years of my life trying to get this book back into print, is the power of Nansen's example. The example of a man who somehow is able to keep his humanity in the most inhumane conditions imaginable. I mean, Nansen could have walked right by Tom Bergenthal. He could have ignored him like any other person had done. He could have figured there was a 0 chance that Tom was going to survive in any case. So why get emotionally involved with this stranger? But Nansen didn't do that. He intervened, he saved Tommy, and as we know, Tommy made it to the end of the war. So what I'd like to do, since I began my story this afternoon, talking about Tommy and his story getting to Sachsenhausen, I'd like to come full circle and tell you what became of him. Now, Tommy, as we know, survived to the end of the war. It's how he was able to publish his memoir. His mother survived to the end of the war in a women's camp, Ravensbrück. His father did not make it. He died in January 1945 of pneumonia in a camp called Buchenwald, just months before it was liberated. And it would take Tommy and his mother another 1.5 years to locate each other in war-torn Europe. But when they finally did that, his mother took him back to Germany, which is where she had been raised, so she could raise him. You have to remember, at least until Tommy is liberated in the spring of 1945, and he's almost 11 years old at that point, he is totally illiterate. Tommy can neither read and write. In fact, Nansen asks him at one point, why didn't your parents teach you how to read and write? And he responds by explaining, well, in the Kielce ghetto, which was where I lived with my parents for 2 years, it was a capital crime for parents to teach their children how to read and write. My parents could have been shot for doing that. So when he gets back to Germany, Tommy's mother hires a tutor. She says to the tutor, I want you to teach my son in 1 year, 12 months, everything he should have learned in grades 1 through 7. So at the end of that 1 year, I can enroll him in the 8th grade, which would have been the grade he should have been in, had he been a normal child going to school. So Tommy has a year of tutoring. Then he goes to the 8th grade, 9th grade, 10th grade. He starts the 11th grade. Now he's a young teenager. He's starting to think about his own life and his future. And he knows that he doesn't want to spend it in Germany. Fortunately for him, he has an aunt and uncle who live in Paterson, New Jersey, so he decides to immigrate to the United States. He arrives in January 1952. So his parents, or rather his aunt and uncle, sign him up at the local high school, Paterson High. Here is a child who's got only 3 years of any formal schooling at all, 3.5 years of any English instruction. Tommy did not know English before the war. He's living in a foreign country. He knows nobody. Every class is being taught in English. He makes it through high school, graduates. He then attends a small liberal arts college in West Virginia. And 4 years later, he graduates as the valedictorian of his graduating class. Tommy then goes to NYU Law School. He gets a legal degree. He then goes to Harvard Law School. He gets a master's degree and a doctorate in the field of human rights and international law. And Tom goes on to have one of the most spectacularly successful careers you can imagine. He wins every accolade in his field that's possible. And his career culminates in the year 2000 when Tom is appointed to the International Court of Justice at The Hague. And here's a picture of Tommy in his judicial robes. Tom is now 86 years old, living in retirement with his wife just outside of Washington, D.C. Before COVID, every time I was in Washington, I would stop in and see him. Now we communicate by email and by telephone. He's a delightful, delightful man. So what I'd like to do to end this talk is I'd like to share with you one diary entry, which to me kind of sums up everything about who Odd Nansen was, the way he thought about the world, the way he interacted with Tom Bergenthal. The date of this diary entry is March 5th, 1945. Nansen has gone to see Tommy to tell him that Nansen's going to be moved to yet another concentration camp, a camp called Neuengamme, located near Hamburg. And he says to Tommy, this is the hardest thing I've ever had to do in my 3.5 years as a prisoner, is to leave you behind. So please promise me that you'll write to me after the war and tell me how you made out. And Tommy responds, and I'm paraphrasing here, yes, yes, of course I'll do that. After all, it is my duty. And Nansen is so struck by the fact that he uses this word duty, that here's a 10-year-old child who's trying to sound like a grown-up. So he writes a diary entry that kind of riffs off of this idea of duty. And when I'm sharing with you this diary entry, just reflect on how incredibly eloquent this diary entry is, how compassionate it is, how hopeful it is, and knowing what we know about Tom's career, how just incredibly prophetic this diary entry ends up being. So here it is. Little Tommy, if only your fellow creatures thought a fraction as much about their duty to you as you do about yours to them, all your prospects would be brighter than they are today. Thank God you don't realize that, and may you never come to realize the abyss of vile injustice that has been done to you. May there be such a future in store for you that all this frightful, this unintelligible cruelty will be expunged from your mind. May you discover that life is not like that. The world is not as it looked to you from the floor of the cattle car when you cried because you were so terribly cold. May you one day grasp and experience its richness and all the warmth and joy, all the beaming light that are reflected in those big eyes of yours, too shrewd for a child, and which are a reminder and evidence of what you are meant to be. Thank you very much for allowing me to share my story of Odd Nansen and his secret World War II concentration camp diary. Good evening.
Hello everyone, my name is Mohammed Karkutli, and today I will be reading the following passage, a reading from Boyce by Mordecai Paldeo. Yad Vashem, the Jerusalem-based Holocaust memorial, honors more than 22,000 non-Jewish rescuers as righteous among the nations. Of these, most are Christians. Also included, however, is a contingent of Muslim rescuers from Albania and nearby regions. As elsewhere during World War II, Jews in Albania were especially targeted for destruction by the Nazis. But their fate there was altered by an ancient and sacrosanct Albanian principle known as Boyce, one's word of honor. In Albania, when a person gives you his Boyce to act in a certain way, then he is committed to abide by it, whatever the circumstances. This Islamic behavior of compassion and mercy celebrates the sanctity of life and a view of the other, the stranger, as indeed one's own close family member. As a result, nearly all of the 2,000 Jews in Albania were spared the furnaces of Auschwitz, for they were hidden or otherwise sheltered by the mostly Muslim population. Survivors relate that Albanians vied with each other for the honor of sheltering the fleeing Jews, a phenomenon unheard of in other European countries under the heel of the Nazis. One person recounted their story. In 1943, at the time of Ramadan, 17 people came to our village. They were all escaping from the Germans. We divided them among the villagers. My family took in 3 brothers by the name of Lazar. We were poor. We didn't even have a dining table, but we never allowed them to pay for food and shelter. The Jews were sheltered in our village for 15 months. Even the local police knew that the villagers were sheltering Jews. In December 1945, the Jews left for Pristina, Kosovo, where a nephew of ours, who was a partisan, helped them. After that, we lost all contact with the Lazar brothers. It was not until 1990, 45 years later, that Shlomo and Mordecai Lazar made contact with us from Israel. All of us villagers were Muslims. We were sheltering God's children under our Besa.
Ele mole rachamim shochem b'meromim hametzei menuchot nechono תחת כנפי השכינו במעלוס קדושים קדושים וטהורים כזוהר הרוקיע מעשירים אסני שמוס אחינו ויחיוסנו אחינו ויחיוסנו שנהרגו ושנשכחו אותו ושנשרוף ביד הרוצחים הגרמנים על קידוש השם בגן עדן תהיה מנוחוסום לא כן בלו רחמים יסתירם בסייסר כנופוף ליעולמים ויצרור בצרור החיים אסן ישמוסיהם Adonai, o nachalo bosom, v'yonuchu b'shalom, al mishkevoseihem, v'namar, Amen.
The following are excerpts from the Promulgation of Universal Peace, written by Abdul Baha. You must manifest complete love and affection toward all humankind. Do not exalt yourselves above others, but consider all as your equals, recognizing them as the servants of one God. Know that God is compassionate toward all. Therefore, love all from the depths of your hearts. Prefer all religionists before yourselves. Be filled with love for every race, and be kind toward the people of all nationalities. Never speak disparagingly of others, but praise without distinction. Act in such a way that your heart may be free from hatred. Let not your heart be offended with anyone. If someone commits an error or wrong towards you, you must instantly forgive them. Turn all your thoughts towards bringing joy to hearts. Assist the world of humanity as much as possible. Be the source of consolation to every sad one. Assist every weak one. Be helpful to every indignant one. Care for every sick one. Be the cause of glorification to every lowly one, and shelter those who are overshadowed by fear. In brief, let each one of you be as a lamp shining forth with the light of the virtues of the world of humanity.
This Kristallnacht, this night of broken glass, gathers us in to remember and honor the lives of those shattered by the evil of the Holocaust. Gathered here together, we are engaged in shining light into those darkest spaces and helping to repair our world. We recognize through the account of Mr. Nansen the importance of bearing witness to the atrocities of the Holocaust so that these horrors can never again be visited upon any other people. As Mr. Nansen wrote in his postscript to his diary, it is never pessimism to look facts in the face, it is a duty. He continues a few pages later, just suppose that from tormented, starving, fear-ridden humanity, instead of the cry for justice, there arose a cry for kindness, for love, the wellhead and deepest ground of life and goal of its eternal longing. This cry for kindness, this cry for love, is the battle cry that we should all heed as we continue to bear witness to the Holocaust and recognize our responsibility to never shy away from the lessons of history. It is up to us to repair the brokenness in the world with acts of kindness and acts of love. Let us say a prayer of hope for our world. Hope for more light in a world where there is too much darkness. Hope for understanding between all people of the world. Hope for unity in a world of divisiveness. Hope for comfort and healing in a world with too much pain and suffering. Hope for warmth in a world that is becoming ever colder. Hope for peace. Peace in our hearts, peace in our world. Let us illuminate the dark places, filling them with light, candle by candle. May it be so.